Nagel, and I graduated from the Behavioral Neuroscience program last June, and I'm continuing in her lab as a postdoctoral researcher. And today I wanted to talk about stress. This has been an interest of mine for the last 5 to 6 years for a number of reasons I'll talk about today, particularly because stress during adolescence is a normative part of development, and it affects a lot of different aspects of the adolescent period, such as cognitive functioning, risk-taking, emotional processing, and also things like alcohol and substance use. So I have an outline that I wanted to present for what I'm going to talk about today. So first, you've probably heard from Dr. Nagel's talk a little bit about the adolescent period and what are the changes going on during this time. I'm going to go over what adolescent demands are, what adolescent emotions and behavior look like, and I'll talk a little bit about sources of teen stress. And then I have a couple areas that I'd like to focus on for what we know about how stress affects the brain and body during adolescence. In particular, how it can affect cognition, emotional response, risk-taking behavior, as well as substance use. And then briefly talk about what the consequences of long-term chronic stress may look like, and how long-lasting stress in adolescence going into adulthood might affect brain and behavior. And then I will mention some coping strategies and also something about the research related in developmental brain imaging lab, and I have some flyers that I brought if any of you are interested and have 12 to 21-year-old kids. Then we'd love to have them in our study. All right, so let's talk about adolescence. I have this cartoon up here, which I like. So the cartoon reads mood swings, with this adolescent saying, "I can't believe you gave away my favorite t-shirt." And then the mom says, "I'll get it back." And the adolescent turns around, like, whatever. So from one minute to the next, you might often notice in your own kids, or from your own adolescent period, that moods can change fairly rapidly during adolescence. And again, this is a normal part of development. So a lot of what's influencing mood changes during adolescence has to do with things that are going on, things that are developing and changing during this time. So some of this includes hormonal changes. During adolescence, there's a resurgence of sex steroid hormones. So this includes testosterone mainly for boys, and then estradiol and progesterone for girls. So adolescents are going through puberty. They're also going through a number of changing peer relationships. So if you think about the adolescent period, which may go anywhere between, let's say, 10 to 11, some might say, or 12, up to 18 or even older, adolescents go through a number of different transitions for school. They go from elementary school to middle school to high school, and so peer relationships might be changing a lot during this time, and those can add stress. Family relationships during adolescence can also be changing. There might be divorce in the family, separation of parents, or maybe even new siblings being born. This can change family dynamics. And along with all of the school changes, there can be academic changes going on. Academic rigor increases a lot, especially in high school. And as adolescents are facing new challenges of trying to figure out what they want to do for their careers and jobs, this might be really challenging. And also we know that there are a number of role changes going on during this time. So adolescence is the period between childhood and adulthood. And so this is a transition period, and adolescents are trying to identify who they are, become independent from their parents, so they can be successful, independent human beings as they transition into adulthood. So here we already have 5 different categories of what types of changes might be going on during adolescence. So you can see just from these few examples that all of these different things can add stress to the adolescent period. And so what can stress result in? Well, today I'll mention a couple different things. Stress can result in increased risk-taking. Stress might also so increases in acute and chronic levels of stress can result in these differences. So the next thing I wanted to show is a list of adolescent demands. And these are categorized into physiological, cognitive, behavioral, and environmental demands. And what I think is particularly striking about this table is that this is from an article published in 1983. And so 1983 was about 30 years ago. But when I look at this list, I think, wow, these are a lot of the things that adolescents today are going through. So the adolescent period is very similar 30 years ago in terms of the potential demands one might have as it is today. So let's look at physiological. Here we see that, again, adolescents are going through a growth period. They're going through pubertal stages. And this can, of course, lead to changes in the body, with secondary sexual characteristics appearing. And physiological changes during adolescence also involve becoming active, being physically healthy, and increasing fitness levels as well. A number of demands in this cognitive domain include self-evaluation, so the desire to achieve perfection might be a cognitive demand for some adolescents. Also, there may be increasing conflicts that appear between parents and their peers as well. So some adolescents may have an increasing number of disagreements between their beliefs and others' beliefs. And then again, role expectations are going to be increasingly demanding as adolescents are trying to understand what their roles are and what others might expect of them as well. So a couple other examples, again, is understanding and responding to fears and feelings of others. This can also be cognitively, but also emotionally demanding. So down here, we have a number of different behavioral demands that are occurring during adolescence. Changing friendship patterns, like I mentioned earlier, for changing between schools or even changing friends within the same school. This is also the period of development where dating usually begins, as well as sexual behavior, and separation from parents as adolescents transition out of high school and move on to college and likely won't be living at home anymore. And then we, of course, have many environmental demands surrounding adolescence. So peer pressure during adolescence is one area that can really greatly increase stress and lead to things like risk-taking and substance use, and other environmental demands, including school structure changes. So again, this list was published 30 years ago, but I think we can all agree that these same demands are valid today, and potentially other demands now with technology and, of course, providing other demands for adolescents as well. So if you attended Dr. Nagel's talk, you might have seen something very similar to this already, and this study basically is looking at how emotional responsiveness in particular is changing during adolescence. And so I don't know how many of you recognize this part of the brain where you see these little red dots. This is the amygdala, and the amygdala is an area particularly known for emotional responsiveness, especially in negative emotional situations. And so what we're looking at here is an MRI image of the brain, and this is called a coronal view. So if you took a slice of my head in this direction, and right around about midline, you would see this. And the amygdala is particularly important for negative emotions, but also has been shown to elicit activation during a variety of different emotional experiences. But what's interesting about this area of the brain is that if you look across age, looking here on the x-axis, you see ages 5 through 30 for participants that were included in this study. And with the triangles, circles, and squares, they've defined children, adolescents, and adults, these three age groups. So what you notice about this is that with the circles, those are the adolescents, they actually have increased amygdala activation during adolescence compared to children and also compared to adults. So this study shows that there is a biological basis for why adolescents might be more emotionally responsive and might respond to emotions in a different way. Their amygdala is actually more active when they look at emotional expressions of faces, such as fearful expressions that were included in this study, compared to other periods of life, childhood and adulthood. So this is a really great study, and more are looking at how emotional responsiveness changes during this period, and especially how it may predict things like psychopathology. But this study was in healthy adolescents, but even in the healthy group, we do see that there are differences between children, adulthood, and adolescence. Okay, so because I'm going to talk about stress mainly today, I wanted to define what stressors are. And this is from a paper by Grant and colleagues, where they define stressors as environmental events or chronic conditions that objectively threaten the physical and/or psychological health or well-being of individuals of a particular age in a particular society. So stressors can mean a number of different things to people. A stressor might include the death of a loved one. A stressor could also include a pet being hit by a car. A stressor can include receiving an F on an exam. So there's a wide variety of where stress can come from. So in this study, in 2008, they wanted to examine the main sources of teen stress. So this is an example where they took individuals who were adolescents but came from a particularly difficult environment. These adolescents were inner city youth, and their stressors might be a little bit different depending on if you compare these youth to other groups with differences in socioeconomic status, differences in parenting, or differences in support. But for this particular group of adolescents, where stress and environmental stress was particularly high, they reported that school and grades caused them the most stress. So if you look on the bottom here, school and grades represented about 35 to 40% of stress for these youth. And then the second source of stress, particularly because this was a low SES group, was money. So many of these adolescents had jobs during school, and so they were trying to earn additional money while they were actually going to school and had to perform academically to be able to go on and be able to find the career of their choice. Relationships also were particularly stressful for this group of adolescents. So this might be because their relationships were changing. This could be due to dating or potential breakups within the last year. Parents were also a source of stress, although a smaller source of stress for these adolescents. And many of these adolescents were dealing with issues that were quite difficult, such as being a mother, holding a job while in school, being pregnant, or having STDs as well. These made up quite fewer number of responses, though. So we can imagine that for adolescents of any type of socioeconomic status or environmental conditions, school and grades might be particularly relevant to stress during this time period. So when we think about stress, we want to try to understand how stress is acting on the brain and body. And in order to do that, it's important to look at where stress comes from and what stress hormone is most relevant here. So this is a figure looking at the brain from a sagittal view. So sagittal would be looking at it from the side, but turned, of course, in this direction. And what stands for corticotropin-releasing hormone. CRH is the main stress hormone, and it's released due to any type of acute stressor. So if you looked at an acute stressor in an individual and measured the output of their hormone, cortisol, that output of cortisol would be due to increases in CRH. And the reason for that is CRH is released from the hypothalamus. This is a part of the brain, and it acts on the anterior pituitary. When it acts on the anterior pituitary releases ACTH. This is another hormone, adrenocorticotropin releasing hormone. And then finally, in the last part of this pathway, ACTH is going to act on our adrenal glands, and our adrenal glands release cortisol. What's interesting about this pathway is that it's a negative feedback system. So once cortisol is released due to an acute stressor, it's going to signal back to the brain to shut off the continued release of CRH. In a system where that shutoff does not happen, there's been something going on with their the negative feedback system, a maladaptive change, and continued release of cortisol is going to result in chronic stress in an individual. So it is adaptive to release cortisol due to an acute stressor, but it is not adaptive to continually release cortisol and not be able to shut off this system. And so cortisol has many different effects on the brain as well as the body. It actually can suppress the immune system as well. And so often individuals who are chronically stressed might get sick more often because of its effect on immune system suppression. So in this particular study, these researchers examined the effect of an acute stressor on brain activity during adolescence. So often when we try to administer some type of acute stress in a laboratory setting, it's a test called the Trier social stress test. And this is a particularly useful test because in both adolescents and adults, it's been shown to increase cortisol levels. And during this test, adolescents are in a room and they're told that they need to be able to come up with a story, a really exciting story that they have to write down. They have 5 minutes to do this, and then they're going to recite the story in front of a number of judges and be filmed, just like I'm being filmed right now. In addition to that, they have to do arithmetic, so they have to do some math problems and solve them in a fairly quickly and timely manner. So they're also being judged on the accuracy of their solutions to these math problems. So this test has been shown to increase cortisol levels. So individuals have been measuring cortisol prior to stress and post-stress, and they see an elevation both during adolescence and adulthood. But social stress might be particularly relevant to the adolescent period because we know that peer relationships are so important during this time. So this social stressor was administered to adolescents, and then within about 4 months of the test, all of these adolescents received an MRI scan. During the scan, they were viewing faces, and the individuals of the study were interested in trying to look at brain activity to these faces. And so what we're seeing here is that on the x-axis, they've taken the cortisol change that occurred during the social stress test, and they plotted it against the brain activity that they observed when they looked at fearful faces in the scanner. And so what we're seeing here is that those individuals who had greater elevations in cortisol, so more stress output, had reduced activity in a part of the brain known as the hippocampus. And so this is something you might have heard of in Dr. Nagel's talk. So the hippocampus is really important. It's actually part of that pathway that I showed you. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal pathway gets regulation or regulatory feedback from the hippocampus to be able to also shut it down. And so the authors concluded that based on these findings, they think that perhaps those individuals who are responding with greater cortisol output may not be able to increase activity in their hippocampus to the same extent as individuals with lower stress signals, lower cortisol output. And so this type of pattern of brain response and its association with cortisol may be particularly interesting and might be a risk factor for some of these adolescents for developing psychopathology. So when we think about stress and how it can affect a number of different functions during adolescence, one thing that I always want to remind people of is that adolescence is a period when the brain is actively developing. And so you may have seen this figure before. It's a famous study by Dr. at UCLA where they looked at ages 5 through 20 and tried to understand what parts of the brain are changing during this wide time period. And they mapped these changes onto these brain images. And what they were particularly interested in looking at is a process known as synaptic pruning. So who here has heard of synaptic pruning? Synaptic pruning is a process that is a normative part of brain development, and it occurs in order to get rid of synapses, the connections between neurons that are no longer needed in order for the brain to become more efficient as we age. So we actually see increased synaptic pruning during adolescence, which results in reduced gray matter volume. So what we're looking at in this figure is gray matter volume, and the scale that we have here is 0 to 1. So areas that are pink or purple show greater gray matter volume, and areas that are dark blue or dark purple show reduced gray matter volume. So if we look at age 5, we see that gray matter pruning has not occurred extensively, except for maybe in the top of the brain right here, known as the motor cortex and sensory motor regions. So most of those parts of the brain have already developed by age 5. Also, if we look back here, this is the visual cortex. The visual cortex has also pretty much developed by age 5. So we don't see any other changes in other areas, but these already have gone through synaptic pruning. So as we continue to look across development, we see that more and more areas are turning dark blue and dark purple, which means that there are increases in synaptic pruning in those areas, resulting in decreases in gray matter volume. And so the areas that are showing the latest developmental changes are the ones located in the front of the brain. And so this is where my arrow is pointing, the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of our brains that we need to be able to make effective and adaptive decisions, and the part of the brain that develops the latest during adolescence. And so we often think of adolescence as a period of imbalance between parts of the brain that are developing earlier, such as the amygdala, or other parts related to reward processing and risk-taking, versus the prefrontal cortex, which is our cognitive control center, the part of the brain that is developing the latest. And because of this imbalance, we might be seeing heightened emotionality during adolescence, as well as heightened risk-taking. So here's my slide on pruning. Pruning, this process of synaptic pruning, takes place at a slightly different age for girls and boys. And the reason for this is that girls and boys go through puberty at slightly different times. Girls mature a little bit earlier, boys mature a little bit later. So by age 11 for girls and about age 12 for boys, the neurons in the prefrontal cortex have formed thousands of new connections. So about this time of life, an individual will have the most connections they will ever have in their entire lifetime. And after about age 11 or 12, the number of connections decreases So when we look at this graph with age in years on the x-axis and volume on the y-axis, we can see that if you would examine the gray matter volume in the frontal lobe, you would see that it would peak right around age 11 and 12, depending on the sex. And then this illustration on the bottom is just a way to show what is happening during synaptic pruning. You have a neuron illustrated in blue in the center, and that neuron has formed many connections with all of its surrounding neurons, and those are illustrated in orange. And during development, those connections are pruned back, again, only leaving the ones that are most important for efficient cognitive processing. And so the scissors on the right-hand side are a way to illustrate the pruning process. So why is the prefrontal cortex important again? Well, in this slide, we see an octopus that is doing many, many different things at the same time. So we know that as we get better at multitasking, we're able to achieve more things at the same time, and multitasking is a part of adolescence. You have to be able to achieve academically. You're often involved in many extracurricular activities, involved in sports, and so you're doing many, many more things than you probably were when you were younger. The prefrontal cortex is also really important for making good judgments about things such as alcohol or substance use. Again, very important for decision making. Adolescence is also one of the first times when individuals are starting to plan for the future. So I always like to give the example of keeping a planner. When you're in 4th grade or 3rd grade, you may not be keeping a planner. But by the time you're in middle school or high school, it's probably important for you to write things down, or maybe these days have a Google Calendar to tell you what your activities are so you can stay organized and plan ahead. And again, all of that has to do with the prefrontal cortex being more capable of making those types of decisions. So when we think about all of these things that the prefrontal cortex is doing, I like to call it executive functioning. This is a term that's broadly used to characterize cognitive functioning during adolescence, which includes decision making, working memory capacity, so being able to hold multiple items of information in your head, as well as being able to correctly inhibit a response when you're supposed to. So how could stress affect cognitive processing? So some of the animal literature on stress has examined how stress may be particularly important for its effects on the prefrontal cortex. And the work in rodents has looked at neurons before and after stress to try to understand how neurons might be changing due to a stressor being induced on these animals. And so in this particular figure, you can see a neuron in the center, and this neuron might be in 2 different parts of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, often called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is at the top of our heads here. This is particularly important for decision making and cognitive control. And another part of the frontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, this sits closer to our orbits and in the front of the brain. And this part is connected to reward pathways. And so this is illustrating that when you look at animals, chronic stress can have different effects on the neurons in these different parts of the frontal cortex. In the dorsolateral area, you see decreased dendritic arborization. This means that the dendrites, the parts of the neuron that are making connections with other neurons, are going to become smaller. When we look at the orbitofrontal cortex, we see that the dendrites in that part of the brain are actually becoming more extended due to stress. So stress is having very different effects on the architecture of neurons depending on where you look at in the prefrontal cortex. And another thing that stress is going to affect is neurochemistry of the brain. So in adolescence, we have increasing levels of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's really important for reward processing, and during adolescence, it increases. And high levels of this neurotransmitter might actually impair prefrontal cortex regulation. So again, we know that a normative part of adolescent development, this increase in dopamine, might be affecting the regulatory capacity of the cognitive control center of the brain. And this illustration of neurons, again, shows that in a no-stress condition, you see a neuron with many, many dendrites making connections to other neurons in the brain. But due to stress, you see a reduction in those dendrites. So this neuron is probably able to make less connections and may not be working as efficiently as the neuron on the left-hand side. So in human studies, there actually hasn't been that much done looking at how stress during adolescence can affect cognitive processing. But I did find this one recent study, and this was interested in quantifying stress over a long period of time. So these researchers looked at adolescents and wanted to ask them about all the stressful experiences they've had over their lifetime, except for the last year. So they didn't want to really look at how the last year's stress might affect their brain, but everything before the last year. And so these questions were related to death of the family, divorce, natural disasters that they might have survived through, losing a pet, losing a best friend, having difficulties academically, so in a variety of domains. And so they quantified a total life stress score for each adolescent, and they wanted to relate that total life stress score to brain architecture. And they were interested in the prefrontal cortex because of the animal literature that has shown that stress might be particularly important for how the prefrontal cortex can function. And so what we're looking at here again is an MRI image, and total life stress is being quantified on the x-axis, and prefrontal cortex gray matter volume is being quantified on the y-axis. So what we're seeing is a negative correlation. So as an individual will have more total life stress, they're showing reductions in gray matter volume in this part of the frontal lobe. And then on the bottom here, they looked at how executive functioning on a working memory task would also be related to gray matter volume. And they found that better executive functioning, so better working memory performance, was related to greater gray matter volume. So there's a relationship here between stress, prefrontal cortex gray matter volume, and also gray matter volume and executive functioning. And when they did a particular analysis called mediation, they found that the volume of the prefrontal cortex was mediating the relationship between stress and cognitive functioning. So it was actually resulting in the relationship between stress and executive functioning being weaker. They also found this for white matter. So we see the exact same relationship in a slightly different part of the frontal lobe, where again, more total life stress was related to reductions in white matter volume. And then on the bottom, we see a positive relationship between executive functioning and white matter volume. And this also survived their mediation analysis. So this means, again, that if you look at white matter volume, stress is related to white matter volume is related to executive functioning. So the relationship between stress and executive functioning is being mediated by the amount of white matter these adolescents have. So I just wanted to bring this study up as an example of how stress and the total amount of adversity an adolescent might have experienced across their lifetime really seems to have an association with structural characteristics in the brain, especially in the prefrontal cortex, which was their hypothesized area. And so the next one I wanted to talk about was stress and emotional response. So in this study, they looked again at healthy adolescents So these adolescents did not have any type of psychopathology, but they wanted to try to understand, again, how the number of severe life events during adolescence or up to that point might be related to characteristics of brain functioning, as well as current levels of anxiety. So here, they found a significant relationship between the number of severe life events and child anxiety. So with greater number of severe life events, we see increased levels of current anxiety in these children. And here, for their neuroimaging study, they looked at how the number of stressful life events may be associated with brain response. And they used a task where individuals were looking at emotional faces, fearful faces, compared to calm faces. And what was really interesting is they did find this effect in the amygdala, the exact region we would expect to be involved in emotional processing. So again, the greater number of severe life events these adolescents had experienced at this point in their life, and the more amygdala activation they had when they were viewing fearful faces versus calm faces in the MRI. So again, there's a direct relationship we're seeing here, not only between stress and cognitive functioning, but also stress and emotional processing. And then also finally in the study, they found that total gray matter volume, so not just in the prefrontal cortex, but any part of the brain that has gray matter, is related to child anxiety. So increased levels of gray matter volume are related to lower levels of child anxiety. So if you're looking more towards the left part of the x-axis, lower levels of gray matter volume are related to higher levels of current self-reported anxiety. And again, gray matter volume is going to generally be reduced during adolescence because of synaptic pruning, but there are certain cases where you don't want to have too much gray matter volume lost as well. So in the third example, I wanted to talk about how stress might be relevant to risk-taking behavior. And this is a figure from Anderson and Tyker in 2009, where they're trying to hypothesize a model for how stress might be affecting reward-seeking as well as prefrontal cortex activity. So in the normal state, in a non-stressful state, the prefrontal cortex allows us to have flexible adaptive behavior and adaptive decision-making. This results in goal-directed behavior. And the pathway that it's connected to might involve things like the amygdala, as well as the nucleus accumbens, a brain region involved in reward processing. However, in a stress-exposed state, an individual's flexible behavior is going to be reduced. So this is why the text has shrunk in that particular box. And then also the prefrontal cortex might not be able to regulate decision-making that well. And so the nucleus accumbens, this reward processing region, is going to become more relevant. And this is why risk-taking and drug-seeking might increase. In this study recently, Galvan at UCLA wanted to look at an ecological measure of daily stress and whether daily stress was associated with increased levels of risk-taking during adolescence as well as emerging adulthood. And so they used a gambling or risk-taking task to be able to examine stress or the effect of stress on risk-taking. And in this task, individuals basically had to choose between safe choices and risky choices. So in a safe choice, if you chose a particular cup, that cup would give you $2 for sure. And then in a risky choice, if you chose between 3 other cups, you might have a 50% chance of winning $4, or you might have a 33% chance of winning $6. So they tried to make it so that the value of that risk was actually equivalent between the risky choice and the safe choice. So when they looked at high stress days and low stress days, so these were days where youth were making diary entries, and they were rating their levels of stress in those diary entries. And on a high stress day, they would go into this research study, and they would do the risk-taking task, and they would also do it on a low stress day. Overall, they found that high stress days produced more risky choices in both the adolescent and emerging adult group than low stress days did. And the reason for this is they think that stress is somehow affecting cognitive functioning, decision-making acutely, and it's reducing the number of safe choices youth are making during the task. So risk-taking might be very relevant to adolescents because many forms of risk-taking during this time involve alcohol and substance use. And just based on some information from the Monitoring the Future study, we know that the levels of alcohol and substance use increase a lot during the adolescent period. So in this slide, we're looking at both 8th graders and 12th graders using a number of different substances. From the left-hand side, you see alcohol is the most widely used substance during adolescence. And you see that about 40 to 50% of 12th graders are reporting use of alcohol in the past month. Many of these youth are also reporting that they've been drunk in the past month, and so this indicates that there might be high levels of use, such as binge drinking, that has led to high levels of intoxication. Marijuana use among 12th graders is about 20% within the past month, and there are many other substances that are also being used, but to a lesser degree. And we know through neuroimaging studies in our own lab and other labs that alcohol and substance use does affect the adolescent brain. But stress may also affect adolescent substance use in a way that might be important to examine because of the relationship of stress and the cortisol hormone. So in this study, we see two groups of adolescents. Group A was a group of adolescents that was initially not depressed. These were healthy youth. Group B was an initially depressed group of adolescents. And in this study, they followed the adolescents longitudinally. So that means that they had some baseline measurements, and then they had some follow-up measurements on the same adolescents. And then they also divided up the two groups into high-stress groups and low-stress groups. And this was based on a self-reported level of stress. In addition to that, they looked at their HPA axis activity. So the HPA axis, again, is the major stress hormone pathway resulting in cortisol output. And they looked at individuals who had low activity, so low levels of cortisol output, versus those who had high activity, so high levels of cortisol output. So what they found was really striking. It's an interaction between your self-reported stress and the amount of stress hormone that you're producing. So if we look at the red line, individuals who are reporting high levels of stress, those who also have high levels of cortisol activity or high levels of HPA axis activity have proportionately larger amount of substance use disorders upon follow-up. So we see that about 50% of these youth who have a combination of high cortisol and high stress have substance use disorders upon follow-up. And so there's something going on about biology and psychology and the two combined that is resulting in much higher rates of use in those adolescents. Because if we look at the blue line, those are the individuals who are reporting low levels of stress. We really don't see a difference whether or not they have low HPA axis activity or high HPA axis activity. So again, this is probably relevant to gene by environment interactions, which are increasingly being looked at as we know that genes don't just make up our behavior, environment doesn't make up our behavior, it's really the interaction of the two that we need to examine in these studies. And we see the same pattern in the initially depressed group, the only difference being that it's a little bit escalated. So we're seeing even higher rates because we know that psychopathology like depression and substance use are interactive as well. So we see that with this particular group, you also see high stress youth having high HP axis activity, reporting about 80% of substance use disorders upon follow-up. So we've seen that stress can affect cognitive processing, emotional processing, can affect risk-taking, as well as substance use. And so in the long run, we know that stress isn't good. And it's important for our HP axis to be able to shut down after an acute stressor and not be constantly active, constantly producing cortisol. And why isn't stress good in the long run? Well, stress can lead to psychopathology. We know that it's one of the major risk factors for developing mood disorders as well as anxiety disorders. And it's also a really large risk factor for developing alcohol and substance use disorders during adolescence. And so later in life, increased levels of stress through adolescence and into adulthood have been linked to cardiovascular disease. And again, they've been linked to a weakened immune system, so individuals having chronic stress are often going to be sick more often. So what can we do about stress? If stress is a normative part of adolescence and everyone's going to go through it, what are the solutions to it? Well, what's really important is that we can balance the amount of stress we have with our coping skills for stress. And so in this balance, we see that exams, divorce, and homework, other types of conflict like job interviews as well, can lead to lots of stress. But coping skills like relaxing, having a healthy diet, having fun, sleeping well, and exercising are all ways we can try to balance that stress. It was really interesting. About an hour and a half before I got here, I turned on the TV for about 5 minutes, and the news was on. And they just reported that they had a new survey. They didn't mention the source, but the new survey showed that 27% of high schoolers are reporting that they have very high levels of stress. And 34% are reporting that they anticipate that within the next year they will have high levels of stress. So I thought that was really interesting given that I was going to talk about stress an hour later, that they just reported on this statistic today. And so we know that, again, many adolescents are going through this, so it's important that they have coping strategies to be able to get through this time. So how can we deal with stress best? And they also mentioned through that study that the researchers found that proper diet and healthy levels of exercise were important to managing stress. Another thing that I wanted to mention was setting realistic goals. I think that adolescence is very challenging because there's so many expectations coming from different directions, both academically, from your peers, as well as your parents. And so being able to set realistic goals, maybe not take 5 AP classes, but only take 3 AP classes, might be a way for reducing some of the stress. And having time for relaxation. I think we get so busy these days that we forget how important it is to have that hour of the day just to yourself, with no one around you. So I think that's really important for adolescents as well, is to have that time where there are no distractions. And then empathy. I think that empathy is really important because sometimes we forget that adolescents are going through a time that is difficult. It's a normative part of development. If their emotions are elevated, it's probably a very normal part of their biology, as we've seen through imaging studies and studies looking at how HB axis activity is elevated during adolescence. So there's nothing strange about that, but being able to empathize with your teens may be very helpful to them. So at the Developmental Brain Imaging Lab at OHSU, we've been doing a longitudinal research study for about 4 years now. So we've been enrolling adolescents in this study for quite some time, doing follow-up assessments on the phone with them every 3 months. And then some of them are also coming back into the lab for a second visit where they receive a second MRI scan. So at baseline, our adolescents come in for an MRI scan, neuropsychological battery, and we also are interested in looking at hormones, so most of them will receive a blood draw as well. And for participating, they get compensated for their time. Parents also get compensated for their time to be able to bring these youth up to OHSU, or we can provide transportation services, bus passes, pay for taxi cab fares if necessary as well. So our studies look at functional MRI, brain activity during particular tasks in the scanner. We also are interested in looking at some of the changes in brain structure during adolescence as well. And this is my last slide with some more information about the study going on. And this study is not the one that's been going on for 4 years. This one started about a year ago, but it's the same idea. It is a longitudinal study with a wider age range that we're looking at. These youth can be anywhere between 12 to 21. Of course, they cannot have any metal in their body because they are going into an MRI scanner. So this includes braces or permanent retainers. And here are some of the potential benefits of the youth participating in the study. They all receive pictures of their brain, so they all get to take home pictures from the MRI scan. They get compensated for their time, $150 for youth and $70 for parents. And I think it's really rewarding for them to be able to learn about the scientific process of neuroimaging and being part of a research study. And so just in terms of the time commitment, we have interviews on the phone. These last anywhere between 1 to 1.5 hours. Actually, those are going to be in person. The initial screening process is through the phone, but parents come in for in-person interviews. So that's where the 1 to 1.5 hours comes from. And then the puzzles and game session is our neuropsychological battery of tests. And this is a little bit longer. This is about 3 hours. And the MRI session is 2.5 to 3 hours. So we often have youth combine all of the sessions into one day if they prefer that. We can also break up the sessions into 3 different days if that works best for everyone's schedule. We often scan on the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, so we're really flexible in terms of time, and evenings, of course, as well, since youth are in school. So I have the phone number for our study up here, and I also brought a stack of flyers you're welcome to take home to share with your youth, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Yeah. When you were showing the slide about the stress, chronic stress, versus the amount of brain matter, and how it was declined for kids, I guess, who are under a lot of stress.
Yeah.
Is that also showing for adults? I mean, is the pattern different for adults than for kids? Adults have more coping mechanisms, or do they have follow the same pattern?
So that's a great question. Most of the work that has been done has been in adults, and they have found correlations between the amount of stress individuals have and prefrontal cortex, gray matter volume, so that's been seen in adults as well. And they've also found correlations with hippocampus. So the hippocampus has been shown to be really sensitive to lifetime stress. and reductions in hippocampal volume are often related to increased levels of stress. This is relevant because the hippocampus is part of our memory system, and so people think that higher levels of stress over one's lifetime might lead to reductions in memory as well. But this is the first study that has shown any type of relationship during the adolescent period. And it was published very recently, so we don't have more information regarding the differences between the two groups. Yeah?
Kind of on the same thing, you had one where synopsis was shrinking with stress and another one was growing.
Yeah.
So does that mean you're getting more of one type of behavior on the growing synopsis, which you're getting more activity there and less? And what was what's shrinking, what's growing there?
So in the animal research, they've seen that you see more shrinking in the prefrontal cortex, the cognitive part of the prefrontal cortex. And you see more dendrites growing in the orbitofrontal cortex, which is connected to our emotional and reward pathways. So there might be more connections forming due to stress among those pathways, but less connections in the cognitive executive functioning pathways.
All right, so you're acting more emotionally, not cognitive.
Yeah.
Anita, I have a question.
Yeah.
We're all sitting here wondering, those great little devices that our kids hang on to and pay attention to all the time, are they considered a source of stress, or are they considered some relaxation time?
That's a great question. So I think there haven't been a lot of studies that have looked at that, first of all. What was interesting is when I heard the study on the news today, they said that the youth who reported high levels of stress also reported that they use video games and electronic devices to be able to cope with that stress, which is exactly what they shouldn't be doing. So I think that oftentimes people will use poor eating habits or things like that that aren't going to be beneficial in the long run as great coping mechanisms. But there isn't a lot of self-reported data that has been collected about what are the highest ways of coping and whether electronic devices are really going to have long-term positive benefits.
Also, with regard to sleep patterns in our teenagers, what should we be looking for in terms of what's healthy and what's not? I mean, sleeping in until 2 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, relaxation, because it's a little stressful for me. So, but what should, how do we measure our expectations with our adolescents, with behavior like that? Is that normal? And so, how do we, because I think sometimes there are sources of stress that start in a household with parents and adolescents that really probably should harken back to the part about having empathy. And I don't know if that always exists. So can you help out with something, a data point?
Yeah, sleep is a really hot topic right now in adolescent research. People haven't really looked at it yet. And we know that adolescents need more sleep than adults. That's been known for a longer time. So whereas adults, 7 to 8 hours is probably a normal amount of sleep a night, adolescents do require more. And because we know this now, many schools are trying to adjust their schedules, start a little bit later to adjust to adolescent sleep patterns. We also know, though, that irregular patterns of sleep have been linked to higher levels of risk-taking, risk for alcohol and substance use as well when they become erratic. So there's probably a fine line between what would be considered, a normal amount of sleep versus excessive sleep. Sleep disturbances, too, not being able to sleep well during the night, have also been linked to increased levels of stress and also increased levels of risk-taking. So, yeah, it's a difficult question to answer just because they do need more sleep, but it's what point are they sleeping so much that it's actually harming them more than benefiting them?
Awesome. So I really appreciate you coming and supporting what we're doing here on our campus. And I very much appreciate Anita taking the time out tonight and being with us to provide this very
Thank you.